Today, we're diving into a story that really shook a city to its core and started this huge conversation about safety, community, and how we remember someone. The tragic murder of Sophie Collombet.
Those are some incredibly powerful words from a judge, and they really get to the heart of this whole story. So, to understand what led to that moment, we've got to go back to a dark night in March of 2014 in Brisbane, Australia. And it all kicks off with this absolutely horrific discovery in a public park, a discovery that would send shockwaves all the way from Australia back to France. So picture this. A heavy storm has just passed through, and the park, which is usually pretty busy, is quiet. A passerby spots what they think is just a homeless person sleeping on a bench. But when they get a little closer, they stumble upon a brutal crime scene. The woman was naked, she'd been savagely beaten, and she had no pulse. The police, of course, immediately launch a murder investigation, and they start piecing together her final steps using CCTV footage and talking to witnesses. So she finishes her night class, she hops on a bus, says goodbye to her friend, and starts that short walk home. She was literally captured on camera just minutes from her apartment, a walk she would tragically never finish. So who was this young woman? Well, the way she was identified is just heartbreaking. Her boyfriend, all the way over in France, saw the police appeals online, recognized her jewelry, and made that awful call. Her name was Sophie Collombet. She was 21 years old, a student from France, just trying to pursue her studies abroad. But, she was so much more than just a name in a headline. Her brother described her as an adventurer, very curious, somebody with friends all over the world. She was working really hard, saving up every single dollar she could to fly back home and visit her family and her boyfriend. Her last email to her mom just a few days before she died was signed simply Kisses. And that was the question on everyone's mind, right? Her roommate put it perfectly. The sheer violence of what happened just didn't make any sense when you heard about the person she was, this gentle, kind soul just making her way in a new country. A post-mortem would later reveal the horrifying, just sickening extent of the attack. Sophie suffered 128 separate external injuries. And the most tragic part? The cause of death was severe head trauma, but she had clung to life for hours, lying there, injured in the park as people just walked by, completely unaware. Okay, so with a crime this brutal, the police response was massive. Let's move to the investigation and see how the search for her killer got started. With no weapon found at the scene and no immediate suspects, the police figured it had to be an opportunistic attack. They threw everything they had at it, an investigation with over 60 officers who immediately started digging through every frame of CCTV footage they could find. And that footage, it gave them their first real lead. They spotted a man who was in the same area as Sophie right around the time of the attack. The police cross-referenced this with a nearby homeless hostel, and they discovered one resident, Benjamin James Millward, hadn't come back. The guy had a pretty significant criminal history, and suddenly, boom, he's their main person of interest. So the police blast his picture out to the public and issue this pretty stark warning. A nationwide manhunt was officially on. They tracked him on CCTV boarding a train late that night, looking really unsettled, before he just seemed to vanish into thin air. And in the middle of all of this, you have these two families caught in an absolute public nightmare, but in such different ways. Millward's own family, even his mom, were making public pleas for him to just turn himself in for Sophie's family. Meanwhile, Sophie's family back in France said they were just so deeply moved by the support from Australia, saying everyone had done everything they possibly could to help. But this manhunt wasn't going to last forever. So now, let's look at the breakthrough that brought the search to an end and started that long road towards some kind of justice. So on April 7th, a hostel down in Ballina calls the cops and says, hey, Millward stayed here a few days ago. From there, investigators found out he'd registered with a job agency even further south, in Coffs Harbour. They sent officers down, and he was taken into custody with no trouble. And as the police were arresting him, Millward makes this chilling, sort of partial confession. He told them he could only remember bits and pieces of what happened, but he admitted that what he had done was horrible. The case against him was, well, it was formidable. He admitted to the assault, but tried to claim he couldn't remember much because he'd taken crystal meth and alcohol. The problem for him, an acquaintance who did drugs with him that night testified that those drugs absolutely do not affect your memory. But the real nail in the coffin was the forensics. The DNA found under Sophie's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life was a near certain match to Millward. So, faced with this mountain of evidence, right before his trial was set to start, Benjamin Millward pleaded guilty to both rape and murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison with a non-parole period of 20 years. And in what was a huge deal at the time, the sentencing was televised, a first for Queensland's history. And the judge, Justice Anne Lyons, she did not hold back at all, delivering this incredibly powerful condemnation of his actions. She even pointed out that she could see the exact spot where Sophie died from her chambers, a constant, chilling reminder of the life he'd taken. But this story doesn't just end with a guilty plea. What happened next was, well, it showed how a community, shaken by such a horrible tragedy, could respond with this overwhelming wave of compassion, just determined to make sure Sophie was never forgotten. The public grief was just immense. I mean, in Brisbane, more than 2,000 people marched through the city and held a candlelight vigil for her. Back in her hometown in France, over 1,200 mourners went to her funeral. They filled up 8 entire books of condolence with messages. Makeshift memorials were just overflowing with flowers and these really heartfelt notes from total strangers. The hashtag #SafeStreetsForSophie started trending everywhere, turning this personal grief into a public call for action. As one of the vigil organizers said, the massive turnout just showed that Brisbane cared and that violence against women was not okay. And to make sure her memory lasts, a permanent memorial was created right there in Brisbane. It shows the mountains that are visible from her home in France and a butterfly. Her brother had shared that just days after her death, a butterfly landed on his hand and stayed there for several minutes, and it brought him this small moment of comfort in all his grief. So in the end, the story of Sophie Collombet's death is one of senseless violence, but her legacy is one of overwhelming compassion. Her family's beautiful tribute reminds us of the vibrant life she lived, and it's that life, that community response, and the memory of her simple, ever-present smile that truly endures.